Hello everybody and welcome to our seminar, QA Financial in partnership with Tricentis. And our guest speaker today is Adam Satterfield, the Global Head of Engineering Enablement at Global Payments, the Fortune 500 company. Adam's going to talk a little bit more about Global Payments and what it does and his role in a minute. First of all, just a little bit of housekeeping. You will see in the top right of your screen, if you need it, live support. So if you have any problems at any point with accessing the content of the seminar, then click on that and you'll be connected to one of our customer services people who will help you. If you go back to your timeline at the end of this session, that's at the top left, click at the top left of your screen. You can visit the Tricentis booth and download some technical white paper content and also some video content from Tricentis that will go into a little bit more depth about some of the topics around test automation that we're going to be addressing over the next 50 minutes or so. After my Q&A session with Adam, there will be time for questions. We'll have a Q&A session. And if you have any questions, please just hit the live Q&A button, which is again to the right of your screen. Send us your question, and we'll put them to Adam either at the end of the session, or if it's relevant to one of the points we're discussing during our Q&A. So please don't be shy. Share your questions. We'll be very happy to discuss them. So. Let's just have a quick look at the agenda for the next 50 minutes or so. There's Adam, our speaker, who you'll meet in a minute. But the agenda, first of all, Adam's going to talk a little bit about his role, his team at Global Payments. And secondly, we'll be moving on to a discussion about Global Payments transition to the Google Cloud, which is the very current project that Adam's working on. And he's going to talk about that, and we'd be very interested to hear. We're going to do a little poll to find out who in the audience is also currently working on a cloud transition project. So we'll have a poll we'd like you to take part in as we come to that topic. We'll be moving on to another topic then, all around test automation and test management, the technologies involved and the decisions that need to be made around tooling. And importantly, how you can build a business case as a QA lead to put to the CTO, if you like, for the tooling and the change that you need. So we're going to be talking about how you manage upwards. We're going to be moving on to talk about Devsecops, a huge topic of current interest because of the transition to working from home during the pandemic. And Adam's going to be talking about how you reskill your team for Devsecops. Then, as I said, we're going to have some questions. Please post them whenever you're ready and whenever you have one. With that, I'm going to hand straight over to Adam to introduce himself. Hi, Adam. Adam's joining us from Atlanta, Georgia, where Global Payments is headquartered. And Adam, thank you very, very much for your time joining us today and preparing for this.
Appreciate the opportunity.
Great. I know we're going to have an interesting time over the next 40 minutes or so. But can you start, please, by just spending a few minutes talking about yourself, where you've been, where you've come from? I know you've got a huge range of experience in different industries, and what you're working on right now.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, appreciate it. Hey, everyone. Hope everyone's having a wonderful week so far. Yeah, Adam Satterfield, been in the industry, we always like to say around 2 decades, so we don't quite date ourselves. But, you know, been through a lot, started as a hardware tester during Y2K. So I managed to get my first job way back, if that actually does date me just a little bit. But, you know, been through the gamut, you know, worked for digital marketing companies, worked for a couple of SaaS-based companies. This was really my first introduction to the cloud way back when. So I've really had an opportunity to see the cloud grow We were one of the first early adopters for Azure back during that time as well. So really seeing, that platform mature, as well as, we actually worked hand in hand at that previous place as well with Google to mature their API capabilities, right, within Google Cloud. So a lot of good experiences there, then moved on to healthcare, and then eventually over to global payments and finance.
Can I just ask, is there a big difference between working in these different industries? I mean, for example, from a compliance point of view, I mean, clearly software in the healthcare industry is a matter of life and death, much more important perhaps than payments in one respect. On the other hand, regulators around the world are increasingly looking at the sort of stability of the software platforms that financial firms have. So there's more scrutiny of quality standards. Are you seeing this?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a really good question. So I would say that, if we look back maybe 5 to 10 years ago, there was a really big difference to where if you worked for an e-commerce platform, it was a lot different in terms of a regulation space than working for a healthcare or a financial company. Mm. However, with most of the companies now, especially with any sort of online presence, having user data, having addresses, email addresses, potentially credit card numbers for any sort of transactions, everyone really has to care about this now. In fact, one of the things I've seen, as we've been working with, within global payments as part of, obviously we're a PCI company, a lot of that extends now down to e-commerce merchants. So if you've got any sort of online presence, then you really need to be, hyper aware of the data that you keep and how you store that. That being said, with companies like healthcare and finance, there are definitely, much stricter rules. You're held to a much higher standard. So, and I know we'll get into some of the Devsecops and, security testing here in a bit, but yeah, I would say everyone needs to be aware of it, but there are kind of, depending on the type of data that you play with, there's some differences there.
And for perhaps people in the audience who are not in the US and have heard of global payments but aren't so familiar with the business, can you give us an idea of the scale of the platform? I mean, and how that determines the volume of work that you're doing in terms of apps and the testing requirements around those.
Yeah, absolutely. And I can also talk a little bit about, our partnership with Google Cloud at that point as well, because I think those will kind of, tie in pretty well together. So, I mean, global payments is first and foremost a technology and software company where, we provide, the ability for businesses to do business. And, we essentially provide the commerce solution. So you can think about, if you go typically into a fast food restaurant, and this is the example I use for my daughter, because she was always like, "Daddy, what do you do every day? You're always on meetings, but I really don't know what you do." So I gave her the example of you go into a fast food restaurant, and a lot of fast food restaurants have now these days touchscreens that where you do the ordering or mobile ordering. And, the food is, your credit card is charged, you're able to take the food. And then that, food company, that fast food company, knows how to get that money from the bank, right? That bank knows how to debit it from your account. Well, kind of global payments is the glue in between all of that. Typically it's not a fast food restaurant or, a coffee, house or, some sort of other, type of merchant, smaller merchant, all the way up to larger merchants that build that solution in-house, right? As we know, right, a lot of times, for those that are, in the software industry business, a lot of times it's easier to find, what we would call like COTS, right? Off the shelf, right? Type of, capabilities. And that's a lot of what, we provide is that, that glue between the banks and the credit card companies and the merchants so they can do business and they can do business very effectively. So kind of to that end, one of the things that I'm sure a lot of folks have seen, the press release that came out here recently with the partnership with Global Payments and Google Cloud. But, we're going to be moving our merchant acquiring technology to Google Cloud as part of a big, migration, right? Data center migration, if you would, to essentially get, our capabilities by partnering with Google Cloud. I know we're going to dive real deep into that here in a bit, but, taking advantage of, cloud technologies and a lot of the newer capabilities of Google Cloud to do that. So not only are we, partnering with, merchants, right, to help them with that glue, we're also partnering with, Google Cloud to essentially provide a much, more robust, capability and tool set, worldwide for that.
Okay. And before we dive a little bit deeper into this transition, this move to Google Cloud, where would you say global payments is on the curve, if you like, to DevOps in the transition from Waterfall to Agile? I mean, how long has digital change been happening in that context?
Yeah, I would say quite a while, and it's a really interesting question, and I think that you'll probably get a lot of the similar answers for a lot of large enterprises. It was that way when I worked, with Anthem, right, previously. I was also a consultant for quite a long time, worked with some very large customers in as much the same way. As the answer is, it depends on which part of the organization you're talking to.
Yeah.
And one of the things, and happy to dive into this, is one of the ways that you want to kind of tackle that is find who needs to deliver software in a much more secure capability and a much more robust way.
Yeah.
Are you going to target your mainframe teams first, or are you going to target your e-commerce front end platforms first, right? And so being able to say enterprise wide, where are we on our journey, I think is maybe the question is better, how do you define where to target, right? Do you use maturity model metrics, right? For instance, is something that we do, right? To say, based on what you're delivering, who you're delivering it to, and how you're delivering it, are you a good candidate to move to the cloud and adopt some of these best practices? And, I would say that definitely a lot of our platforms that are running in the cloud are very mature from that standpoint. And, we've got some that are moving over that are, kind of following along in that journey.
And I guess one of the other, related topics is how you make sure that best practice and innovation and learning is spread throughout the business, because all businesses have, centers of excellence, perhaps where, there's a particular transition happening, as is in the case with your part of the business, how you share what you've learned with your colleagues across the enterprise.
Yeah, exactly right. And I oftentimes listen to some folks talk, and there seems to be a dichotomy between, do you go top down or bottom up, right, to drive change? And I'm very much of a fan of, you really have to do both, right? One of the things that I'll teach my folks, and something that for those of you that hear me talk, is I use a technique called WIFM, which essentially stands for what's in it for me. So whenever we're trying to drive change, we take a look at, for instance, maybe we're trying to drive some automated unit testing into the development organization. Well, we'll look and say, hey, we know that it's the best practice and we know that everyone should be doing it, but how does this affect the developer from a day-to-day standpoint? So we'll go to them and say, hey, by doing this up front, yeah, it costs a little bit more time, but you're not working weekends, right? You're not getting code immediately thrown back over to you from the QA team, right? You're having a higher increase of quality, which in turns, could potentially help with, higher bonuses, higher quality, customer satisfaction scores go up. So you kind of understand, looking at it from their angle. Another thing that we like to do is, you mentioned, center of excellence, right? So we kind of focus more on community of practice. I think that in a lot of industries, a center of excellence almost is a dirty term now, where they kind of feel that it's someone sitting in a silo demanding that someone else is driving change to an organization. So we like to do that bottom up of community of practice. And again, happy to kind of go into a little bit about how we do that. We've had a lot of success with the community of practice. And then really from that top down is going to be your metrics, right, to kind of help your leadership team understand how things are going.
And I guess the test center of excellence has always been also associated with offshoring.
Yeah. So, and that's really why, one of the things that we do is we build a community of practice that, branches right between, offshore and onshore. So everyone is involved in the community of practice. We don't, really take a look and say, well, we have an offshore team. It's like, no, you're part of the team, right? You're part of the community of practice, right? It doesn't matter where in the world you work, right? You're part of the community of practice. And, some great things that we've done out of this is, building universities where folks can actually take, kind of formalized training, get certificates, and, really kind of feel like they're making progress and, pushing the level of quality forward in the organization.
Excellent. Good. So now we're going to dive a little bit deeper into this, this current project, this transition of global payments merchant services platform to the Google Cloud. Before we do that, we're going to have a poll. And if everybody could vote on this, that would be extremely helpful. You will see this now appearing. There it is, slightly to the right of your screen. Are you working on a cloud transition? So we simply want to understand, how many of you out there are actually doing that. And yeah, it's 80% now. 80% are indeed working on that transition. Okay. Apologies. I should have turned off my phone. Most of the audience here today are working on a cloud transition, Adam. So they're going to be very keen to hear how you're tackling the move to Google Cloud. So do you want to dive straight in? What's the difference, for example, between Google Cloud and the other big cloud providers in terms of the skill sets you need, in terms of the technologies you need? Is there a difference?
Yeah, I would say yes and no, there's a difference. And honestly, it depends on the role that you have in the organization as part of the transition. So, if you're someone as at a, and this is, one of the things that we love to do in terms of, learning for a lot of the stuff is, Udemy, Coursera. I'm a huge fan of Linux Academy that provides, different layers of training and even, direct training, directly from companies like, Azure, AWS, and GCP, Google Cloud, is, understanding one of the first things you want to do is get the training appropriate for your level of your role, right? So if you're a product owner, you don't really need to know architect level cloud technology. And those are the types of levels where things are pretty different, right? So the architecture, within GCP, Azure, and AWS, there's quite a bit of differences in the way they call, the VMs. A good example is, AWS, they use spot instances. Google Cloud calls them preemptible VMs, right? So if you didn't really understand what those were, it would sound like they're completely two different things, even though they're relatively the same thing. So, first and foremost, you need to really kind of understand it at the level you're going to be interacting it with. And second is, coming over from a skill set standpoint, is once you kind of understand the basics of a cloud, right, the basics of security, of, identity management, things like that, you can relatively easily move over from one to another with just some, basic level training. Now, again, the exception is going to come as, in that architecture level, right? If you're, doing things on a DevOps standpoint, infrastructure as code, really trying to drive in from maybe a cloud architect or, cloud engineer, yeah, they're definitely going to be different. And that's really where you kind of start seeing some things. But at a high level, not a big difference. But once you start getting into kind of like the actual, fine details, there is definitely quite a bit of difference.
Okay, good. Where exactly have you just started this transition? It's the transition of your merchant services to the cloud. That means what does that actually mean in terms of the pipeline for continuous app delivery? What will the result be?
Yeah, so I mean, some of it you can kind of take a look, and one of the things we always like to work on, with teams is, education is probably the number one part that you have to work on when it comes to cloud transitions. I find that it runs the gamut when people talk about cloud transitions from, folks in the business and the product side thinking that it's magic once you work to the cloud, and then all you have to do is flip a switch and your new technology is running right in the cloud. And some say, oh, it's a completely different environment. It's nothing like we've ever seen before. It's raining cats and dogs, and it's going to take, 5 years to do things. So, in terms of an organization, one of the things you really have to kind of take a look at is there's really only one or two ways to kind of focus on things. Either you do a raw lift and shift, right, of where you're grabbing what's running in your current, on-prem infrastructure and you put it in the cloud, or you're going to do a modernization effort, right? And that's really where you kind of have to, it really comes down to the financial dollars, as well as, what makes sense on what you're trying to deliver to your customer. I've seen things go, successfully both ways, to where folks, do push for a modernization, something that takes a lot longer. And a lot of times your ROI starts really dipping down very quickly if you try to do more of a modernization approach as opposed to a lift and shift. However, if you go for more of a lift and shift approach, you tend to pick up some debt right? That you essentially eventually will have to do modernization. However, if you've already moved everything over, you can start shutting down your on-prem. So, I would say, in terms of our journey, right, we're definitely, very heads down, right, into that, right? Some have decided to go modernization, some have decided to go raw lift and shift. It really kind of just depends on what your ROI is there and what your business goals are.
Okay, so you mentioned the ROI.
Yeah.
What will be the impact of the move to the cloud? I mean, in terms of speed, the volume, and the quality of the software that you're engineering?
Really, I think the impact kind of boils down to, a large reason why a lot of folks like to run their stuff in the cloud, right? Number one is going to be flexibility, right? The ability to, spin up and spin down, resources, as you may potentially need them, almost like some sort of like flexible, right, type infrastructure. One of the next things is definitely cost, right? I think the ability to have access to various tools, monitoring, cloud native capabilities, right? Native security tools, native, logging and monitoring tools, and even, from some things that we're exploring as well, is some native tools to run Selenium even a bit better. So, I'd say those are probably some of the two, number ones that we kind of look at right from that side. And then lastly is, kind of future skill set as well. You're having a lot of folks, as you go out and you try to hire developers and testers and DevOps folks, not many of them want to really play in on-prem environments, right? They want to play on the latest and greatest. So if you want to get the latest and greatest talent, right, you really kind of have to start looking at that as a future path as well. Yeah.
By the way, I was probably a little premature in reading out the result of that first poll because people were still voting. In fact, the balance shifted quite a lot. 57% of the audience is currently working on a cloud transition, and 43%, I can do the math. So I think that's kind of interesting because we've been seeing reports in the news over the past couple of days that there's been a huge amount of new business generated by Google Cloud, and I assume by the other cloud providers. A lot of people are making that transition right now. After talking about the cloud for so many years, financial services firms really are making that move now, and perhaps COVID has accelerated that decision. I don't know. I don't know whether you have a view on that.
Yeah, no, I definitely think it does, especially as we have a lot of folks, working from home. I've seen in certain, places, from working with a few peers in the industry, where they're shutting down, buildings and consolidating buildings. Some of the buildings that they shut down, for my peers working, there's a data center in there.
Yeah.
Right. So why would we, keep that building open simply for a data center, right, when we can shut things down, potentially move it to the cloud? So absolutely, but I definitely think it all comes back to the ROI. I've definitely seen in my years of doing this, probably at least a dozen to 2 dozen start and stops, not at Global Payments, but other places I worked at for cloud migrations, where it was thought, hey, let's just get this done. And then, later on, the financial folks come and say, hey, our ROI is blowing through the water. We need to stop this. We're bleeding money.
Okay.
So, really doing that upfront due diligence is, absolutely critical.
Okay, good. Now we're going to move on to test automation and test management. And I know you're going to share some slides with us. So perhaps you'd like to get those up, Adam. And while you do,
sure.
We'll have a second poll, again, just to find out exactly how many, what the emphasis should be in terms of our conversation to make it most relevant to our audience. You'll see the poll. We just want to know what percentage of your testing is automated. Very general question. Let's just take end-to-end testing as the subject here. Is it none? Have you absolutely got zero automation? Is it something like 10 to 20%, 20 to 50%, or more than 50%? It looks like relatively high. The majority is above. Clear majority is above 20%, and quite a large proportion, 44%, above 50%. So a lot of the people are well on the curve to full automation. Does that surprise you, or from what you know of your peers in financial services, that's typical?
I would say it surprises me a little bit. We've got, especially when I was, working as a consultant for a while, and a lot of the large organizations that we partner with, the percentage was very low. And if it was high, it wasn't very effective automation. I always like to tell the story. I worked with someone for a while and they said, hey, can you look at our automation, suite? It runs every day. And it actually took 36 hours to complete. And I was like, well, technically it runs like every, day and a half.
Yeah.
But, and that's what we find a lot, where I think it's very easy in a lot of, enterprise organizations to let legacy automation kind of really get out of control.
Yeah. Well, again, I was watching the bars on the first votes coming in. It was probably a little early. It takes people a little time to vote. Actually, the clear majority now, 50% is 50% of people are saying it's between 20 and 50%.
Yeah, I think that would resonate a bit more for sure.
More like a reliable industry benchmark. Okay, so let's talk about the tooling you've chosen at Global Payments.
Yeah, absolutely. So, one of the things, especially as you're going through things like, a cloud migration or data center migration, working with a lot of very, complex, technology, I think having, a proper test management tool is absolutely critical. So, I've been a fan of Qtest for a really long time, used it at quite a few places that I've worked at. And so for us, it just really works, really well to have a central located place to house your test case, information. Now, one thing, we'll note here as well is, I really enjoy working with, the Tricentis folks as they, roll out a lot of this new information and new capabilities. For instance, I'm a huge fan of Explore. So one of the big things that I always try to work with, our testing team on is to do, a lot of exploratory testing, which can be really difficult to track where you've gone and what you've done. So, Explore will essentially kind of take, screenshots. It'll help you understand, kind of where you've gone as you kind of go through your testing. So, I've just found, I know there's a lot of, options out there. And really for us, Qtest has kind of been that one that's really kind of helped us, standardize the way that we kind of, house our test scripts. Okay.
And in terms of building the business case for investing in a particular tool, this topic of, managing upwards, perhaps dealing with stakeholders in the procurement process who have different time horizons, perhaps a shorter term time horizon than you might have as an engineering lead, Adam. How do you explain and present the ROI for the investment in something like Qtest?
Yeah, absolutely. So, one of the things, it's definitely a process for sure. So there's a couple of things that, when I do some leadership mentoring, three main topics that I'll hit, right? First and foremost is never give up, right? If you truly believe that this is something that, will make or break or have a very strong impact to the organization, keep up with it. Because a lot of times, when building your ROI and, trying to drive a tool in the organization, the first answer is pretty much always going to be no. It's almost always no, no matter where I've worked, it's been no, because, businesses, especially businesses that, have, boards and, stockholders, they have a fiduciary duty to protect the money that they spend. So a lot of times the answer is no, right? When you try to build your case. And a lot of times the answer is no, because the ROI doesn't make sense. And so one of the things you really kind of have to understand is, what are you looking at in terms of an ROI? Are you looking at hard savings or are you looking at soft savings? And so hard savings essentially is, you have the ability to cut out another tool. You have the ability to cut out, potentially, reduce headcount somewhere, reduce some overhead somewhere. Versus soft savings is, I'm going to increase quality. I'm going to increase customer satisfaction. I'm going to decrease defects, which is going to result in, X, Y, Z. For instance, one of the things that I had done, at a previous place was come up with the cost of a defect. The organization had no idea how much a defect actually wound up costing them. And if we look in the industry, which right now, I think the average is around $6,000 or $7,000 per defect that makes it into production is how much it costs a business.
Yeah.
And so, but businesses will look at that as a soft savings. However, if you can show that by pushing in a new tool, automation tools are a great way to reduce defects and kind of soft savings. And so understanding both of those from an ROI model standpoint will definitely be key. So if you're looking at implementing a test case management tool, you need to make sure you take into account both of those. For instance, how do you currently track your test cases? Right? Is it through a Word file? Okay, great. How long does it take you to upload that Word file? How many errors have you seen? How many defects have been created as a result of faulty test cases? And start building your model based on that, and kind of recognize that with a lot of tools like test automation tools, test case management tools, performance testing tools, you're not really going to find a lot of hard savings.
Yeah.
And that's one thing I think is an educational piece for is for leaders, is they love to latch onto hard savings. But you have to understand that that's not the only thing that drives a successful business.
And so where do you get the data for that argument from, the capex versus opex argument? I mean, does Q-Test help you with that, for example?
Yeah, definitely. And so, I mean, I'm a big fan of trying to remove as much emotion out of conversations like that, and, drive through with data, right?
Mm-hmm.
So yes, you can get information. So for instance, if, we wanted to push in a new performance testing tool, right? So what we could do is we could go into Q-Test and find performance related defects, right? Or issues that wound up going to production where potentially customers complained. So I would use Q-Test data. I would use whatever we're using from a production support, right? Repository as well, right? Kind of pull that in. So that's one of the kind of my trick that I always keep up my sleeve is anytime you're trying to do this stuff, your customer support team is your biggest ally in these types of things. Because if you can reduce calls to a customer support organization by increasing the quality, then they will be your best friend forever.
Okay.
So it definitely, it gives you the ability to have your data in a singular location, which is absolutely critical to trying to make these decisions. And so that's really what you can have to figure out is it's a classical, data problem, right? What data are you trying to prove and what data are you trying to change? And just recognize and, partner with, someone from your finance organization to say, hey, is this a soft savings or is it a hard savings?
And is it fair to characterize the decisions you're making as a trade-off between speed and quality and volume of apps?
Definitely.
You have different priorities for apps depending on how sensitive or critical they are. How do you manage that?
Yeah, so a little bit of that is going to be, where I know we had briefly talked about this in one of our previous conversations. You have to become a master of the proof of concept. Right. So one of the things is, I love to do is, say we want to implement a brand new tool and say, hey, I believe this is going to increase our speed, but it won't negatively impact, the amount of time it takes for the developers to do their piece. And so let me have a small application. Maybe I'll do it in a development environment or QA environment, right? And we'll kind of run that and kind of test that out. And then you can kind of figure out if that trade-off is there, right? Does the cost give you the speed that you want, which will help you potentially increase, right, your ability to deliver. So for instance, one of the things that, when I worked with a SaaS company a number of years ago, is I wanted to hire in an entire team of SDETs. And at that time we were doing one release every 2 weeks. And I said, hey, if we get this team in, we can increase our automation, we can increase our data capabilities, we'll be able to release faster. And one of the things we were able to prove out by bringing in one SDET for a team is we could release twice a day with our automation capabilities. So that was, hey, if we spend more, we'll be able to deliver more. And we sat and we worked out the ROI and said, hey, by being able to get features to our customer faster, we'll be able to reach our milestones faster, which will make our board happier, right? And we'll get approval for that. So it's the one, I guess, thing that I'll really say here is don't get caught in saying, if I want to have this new tool, I must always look at this type of saving, right? And use your proof of concept to really kind of help you determine what is your end result. Because sometimes we've done a proof of concept and it just hasn't worked out. And we said, okay, we really didn't lose anything. And especially with as aggressive as a lot of companies are in the market right now, is a lot of them would be willing to give you a trial to help you with that proof of concept, free of cost.
Yeah, good. And is code quality benchmarking in the mix here? I mean, I believe you mentioned that you do static analysis for benchmarking code quality.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a critical part, right? Because, without having that, code quality analysis, it's hard for your testing team to really know, what's landing on their plate, right? Because you can talk to the developer, you can talk to the development team, and they'll say, yeah, we tested it. You say, okay, great. Where's the proof? Well, we kind of did ad hoc testing, right? I fired it up and made sure it worked. Well, okay, that's not really what we want, right? We want to see, a static, code quality analysis, right? Stats, trends, rules, engines, things like that, to be able to kind of see not only from what are we getting at this point, but are we, ultimately making the end product, better or worse? So one of the things that I used to do for our leadership team is essentially build that dashboard of, hey, what are we delivering? Are we delivering better quality, in each release, or worse quality in each release? And we took things like, the static code quality analysis tool information, customer support tickets, defect trend analysis, and we put all those together, and we're able to show, a direct correlation that, hey, our defects may have not gone up, but what we released, we had a lower static code quality analysis capabilities, and our customer support tickets went up. All right, so we can show direct correlations to those things.
Good. Okay, thank you. And before we move on to test data management, which is a big challenge we know that a lot of our audience is facing right now, how you connect those data lakes with your testing, your enterprise data management with your software development requirements. I did also just want to ask you about the open source tooling options, the alternatives to off-the-shelf automation and management products like Tricentis. How do you evaluate open source?
Yeah, so it used to be, and I remember the days, right, in the early 2000s or so, when open source was a dirty word, right? There was no way you were going to get open source capabilities and tooling inside of a large enterprise. Luckily now that has definitely changed, to where we have the ability to do open source. So one of the things I would recommend is, if you're looking at open source tools, number one is have some guidelines around what has already been approved and what has not been approved. For instance, places I worked and where we have right now is we've got a list of libraries and tools that have been approved that are able to be used, right, by organizations. And a good example of this that I've seen with a lot of folks is code repository tools. If you look at the number of hack attempts that are happening in the US right now, a lot of them are targeting things like code repository tools. And so, as well as we've all seen things like, supply chain, right, attacks as well. So, when you look at things like that, you need to have a way that you can really kind of, especially for the larger companies, control which open source tools are rolling in. So number one is, have that list of what's already been approved. And number two is, there are security tools out on the market right now that will scan those libraries and tools and look for vulnerabilities. So you want to make sure that's integrated as part of your pipeline. So that way, in case you do have, potentially a rogue developer or a rogue tester, whoever it is, that goes and grabs just a random library because they searched it out on Stack Overflow, that it doesn't have a known vulnerability kind of built into that. So there's a lot of really good tools and capabilities on the market right now that'll kind of help you with that. And some will also do things like, we know a lot of folks love to go out and grab, Docker images, right, and potentially use those. So there's great security tools built into either, coming from Docker. I believe it's called Sync or something like that. I'll have to get back with you on that one. But there's also some paid for tools as well, right, that'll scan your images. So, I'm very much of a trust but verify, right, type methodology. So, have that list that's approved. If you have people, have a backup, right, and that backup is everything that goes into production is scanned, and that scanning constantly happens.
Okay, test data management. Let's move on to that. A huge topic, a huge challenge. A lot of financial firms, for example, are trying to assess the benefits of test data virtualization. Are the maintenance costs, when you factor in those maintenance costs, is the upfront cost of an investment in virtualized data worthwhile from a return on investment point of view? Where are you in terms of your management of test data at Global Payments?
Yeah, and so one of the big things that I try to focus on is not only virtualization, and some of this is going to help you with your ROI, but what is your test data accuracy?
Mhm.
Right? I think it's something that a lot of folks tend to ignore when looking at a test data management tool. A lot of times, folks are very focused on security, which is obviously very important. But if you've got a secure data set that's the wrong data, is it actually really useful to anyone? More than likely not. So one of the things that you always want to have in your test data management capability is actionable data. So for instance, we've done this with healthcare, we've done this with finance. Are you testing with the right merchant? Are you testing with the right customer that has the right data, right, the right location, the right settings and things like that, to make sure that you're testing with a representative sample, right, of what your customers are actually doing, in production on your application. So, and a lot of times what I find is we've got these, really, a lot of organizations have these really fancy test data management tools. And then the tester on the back end is spending hours, if not days, trying to find that right data to do their testing. And a lot of times the accuracy is not very good. For instance, when I worked at a place when I was a consultant for a while, and we found that the accuracy was around 40%. And we took a look at the data that the testers are using in their testing. We took a look at the data that the customers were reporting issues from, and they did not match. So they matched about 40% of the time. And so, and there was no automated way to do that. And the testers typically spend about 10 days trying to figure out this test data. So, when you try to think about the move to Agile, right, does it really do you any good to have a really fancy test data management tool if it's the wrong data?
Okay, and you mentioned really at the outset of our conversation today the security requirements around data, the
Yep.
fact that we're dealing with a lot of customer data that is obviously confidential. So presumably you're also spending quite a lot of time anonymizing data and masking data.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and some of this goes back to what we had talked about, from an education standpoint, right? To where it used to be that you could be a tester and be relatively ignorant of the security controls, right, inside of your organization, as long as you were kind of testing in your environment. But now you really have to be, again, I used the term before, hyper aware of the security controls, the security regulations that govern your organization. So one of the things I've seen companies do that we're working through as well is kind of building that secure SDLC, right? Building security inside of the SDLC, and not only doing it and sending it out hoping someone reads it, but actually giving active training for folks so they know, and this is one of the things that I always like to teach as well, is that testers are your foremost experts on your product. So why wouldn't we give them the ability to identify problems ahead of time that they can then know where to go to get those problems resolved? So if we've got the improper test data that's coming through, that they can go and say, hey, red flag, right? This is definitely an issue. We need to bring this up to someone, instead of letting a tool catch it several weeks or a month down the road or whatever it is, right? Or a security auditor coming in saying, hey, this test data is wrong, right? Or we've got a live credit card number, right? Why not train your testers up front to recognize that right away?
Okay, and so how are you doing that? How are you turning your testers into security experts?
Yeah, so it's a couple of ways. One is, I'm a huge fan of the work that the OWASP organization has done. So, if you have a front-facing application, if you have an application that goes on the web, and you're not familiar with OWASP as an organization, highly recommend taking a look at that. They have recently migrated a lot of their information over to a GitHub page. And it's a lot of very good quality information. I think we'll try to get that sent out to folks. So one of the number one things that we do is we start with the OWASP, right, technology. So they have something called an OWASP top 10, which is essentially the top 10 vulnerabilities that are found in front-facing and internet-facing applications. And we train our testers to recognize these. And so we partner with the security team and we build a set of standardized test cases that essentially the tester doesn't need to be a security professional to run. They run them. If they see an issue that falls in a certain parameter, they can then highlight that. All right, so that's really kind of the first thing, is starting to integrate some of those security best practices by driving through OWASP. The second is, like I mentioned before, with the secure SELC is, one of the things you want to make sure is if you come out with best practices, I'm sure we've all seen this in enterprises, nobody really reads them, right? It's hundreds of pages of stuff. People are busy, they click the checkbox and they go off and they do their work. So one of the things that we do is, we have, constant review sessions with the teams. We essentially, kind of open it up, we review it with them. Any new hire that comes in is part of the knowledge transfer, right? Training, or, if someone's switching over to a job, it's part of the core training that they actually go through, where we review it with them, we open it up, we talk about it, we talk about the various, pieces. So I think that's a big piece, right? Just making it part of like the day-to-day life, right, of the testers, right? Security, and helping them understand that just like exploratory testing or risk-based testing, right, security testing falls much in that same type of category, and it's not something who's just someone else's responsibility.
Okay, and do you refer to Devsecops as a thing at Global Payments, as a way of describing how you should?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. And it's one of those things where, I try not to latch onto buzzwords, too much. And I know that Devsecops, and you've also heard, test ops and test sec ops as well. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So there's a lot of those terms that are kind of, being kicked around right now. And, I think they're actually good from the standpoint of, if people look at this and say, yes, security is my responsibility, I don't really care what they call it.
Yeah.
Right? But if DevSecOps helps someone to say, security is my responsibility, I think that's absolutely amazing. Okay. And really what we've done and what we've found is, within DevOps, similar to testing, is, especially in these days, one of the things, we've found with some data is, hack attempts are up in some industries like 800%. Yeah. With I saw one healthcare company, is they have, and it was a hospital, they fight off 70,000 attempts per day of hack attempts of people trying to steal their data. Wow. That's astounding. Yeah. So if you've got the people who are building your pipelines who don't intimately know about security and how to secure those pipelines, that's a huge risk.
Good. Okay. Let's move on to some questions, and with some questions, Adam. We got a few good questions here. And if anybody else would like to add to the queue, please do type in your questions now. We've got 5 minutes or so to deal with some questions. We'd love to hear from you. Question number one, and I'm reading these out. I can't. I'm sort of hostage to the way people have phrased the questions. You'll just have to interpret them the way you wish, Adam. What do you recommend for testing against production databases?
Oof, that's a tough one. So testing against production databases. I mean, to me, part of it is, what are you trying to actually validate, right? Are you trying to validate, data accuracy? Or are you trying to validate that nobody is actually, modifying your database? Gosh, and it depends on, are you using, a NoSQL versus SQL database? I mean, that is a really, really tough question. I mean, one of the things that we typically would do is we would take, representative samples and use something like a preemptible VM and a Docker image and slap some, kind of a pseudo production environment up and run some tests, kind of based on that to just validate some basic pieces. I mean, otherwise, logging and monitoring is your friend. We used to do a lot of testing against the logs. So if you're using something like an Elasticsearch, or something like that, where you can actually, grab some very rich data out of that, I would, that's what I would recommend. Otherwise, kind of getting in and muddling with production databases is a braver man than me.
Okay. Next question. Thanks for a great presentation, Adam, and thank you. It has been great. Can you describe the procurement process at Global Payments? I guess we're talking about we were talking earlier about how you present a business case for the tools that you want to engineer the software according to the objectives that you've set with the business leaders. But what is actually the process, I guess, is the question for dealing and pulling together all the stakeholders involved in the final decision?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I can't necessarily go into very specifically, global payments, but what I can say is, with working through multiple large enterprises, really that first thing you have to understand is, what are you trying to accomplish, right? So once you start kind of figure out, a lot of organizations will have a template already provided for you. So if you don't know what that template is, go to your procurement office and say, hey, do we have a business case template? I was 95% of especially large enterprises are going to have a template that you can use. Additionally, a lot of times the folks in the procurement office I find are like really exceptionally nice. They want to work with you and they'll actually very much help you, because you can go to them and say, hey, I would love to pick this tool up. Do I do the negotiations? Do you do the negotiations, for prices and things like that? So, build that partnership right with your procurement team. So if you don't have a template, one of the things I would just kind of recommend is, do just some very quick, Google search to kind of understand, very basic business case templates. But, by and large, you want to understand what your stakeholders are, and stakeholder is who's impacted, right, by the tool, both, actively and passively, as a lot of people forget, as well as kind of understanding, does it fall under things like opex, capex, hard savings and soft savings. So, there's some great, YouTube videos on, corporate finances. So if you don't know what the difference is between like opex and capex and hard savings and soft savings, do a little bit of research there, and it'll really kind of help you as you're having conversations with your finance team. But by and large, work with your procurement team. I found that most of them are exceptionally awesome and wonderful to work with.
And you did say earlier that your customer services people, the people who actually interface with, the people who are using your platform are often your greatest allies.
Absolutely, yeah. Because anything you can do to kind of help their job out, they're going to love you.
Okay. You were talking about where you go to find information, where you go to find templates. Here's a related question about the cloud. For those of us who are looking to grow in the cloud, can you rank who you would choose for cloud education and why? So I guess actually, I'd add just something to that. Is Google good at helping you use Google Cloud? I assume.
Yeah, they definitely are. All the major cloud, providers are, very good at helping you to teach, right? You're helping to teach you the information. Personally, I'm a huge fan of Coursera. I love the certificates you get. You can link them on your LinkedIn page. They're great from a professional standpoint. I love Udemy for kind of quicker hits. So for instance, if I want to learn a little bit more about, Kubernetes or Docker or something like that, that's a great way to go. And then if you want more of like a traditional, structured plan, Linux Academy is wonderful. Well, they'll actually take you from the very, very basics all the way to very complex and almost like a class type format. And Coursera will as well. So, and most of them are so cheap that, it really doesn't cost that much to do those. But yeah, you can start with the cloud providers. Sometimes the classes aren't necessarily structured for ultimate beginners. So you can that's when you would go to something like Coursera or a Linux Academy.
Okay, so time for one more question, perhaps. I think it's a very general question. We've covered some aspects of this in our conversation already, Adam, but what has been the impact of WFH working from home? I guess let's expand on that a little bit. We talked about the increased security requirements. Has it fundamentally changed the way that you're going to work in future? More remote working? What's happened to efficiency and productivity in the team?
I've actually found that efficiency and productivity has gone way up for most of the organization. And a lot of it, I think, is, we've got quite a few folks who are, still very happy to be doing the work that they're doing. I think from a leadership standpoint, working on things like, empathy and understanding for folks, that you'll have like dogs barking in the background, kids kind of coming in, those types of things, right? So kind of understanding that happens. But, from a security side, I would say less so from, our, day-to-day piece, but more so definitely from an enterprise or organizational standpoint. It certainly has changed the way that things work, because you don't want a family member walking by, someone working, and there's, PPI up on someone's, or, HIPAA information or something like that up on, someone's laptop. So, some of the training has definitely changed, right, for a lot of organizations as they kind of help folks understand how to adapt to that new world. So I would say, yes, it's changed, but has it really affected our day-to-day as much? Not as much.
Okay. Well, Adam, I think we should leave it there. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Doing all that prep for this seminar and answering those questions. One final question, sorry, it's just popped up. I hope you don't mind if I add this one.
Oh, sure, of course.
How have you brought the database into the fold in your larger DevOps processes at Global Payments? Not quite sure how to interpret that one. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, and the unfortunate answer is it really depends on the type of database that you're talking about, right? Are you dealing with a BigQuery, right, database? Are you dealing with something that you're, tearing down and building up every single time? So the main thing that I would recommend is, partnering with your DevOps person, right, and your database team, and make sure that they're in lockstep. Because especially when you're dealing with things like Terraform, and I have seen this at previous places that I worked at, that I saw a Terraform script rip down a database and delete it because the DevOps person didn't really know what it was pointing to. So when dealing with things like that and those strong capabilities, make sure you're in lockstep and that everyone really knows where the scripts are going and how things are getting updated.
Okay, good. Well, thanks for asking that additional
question,
answering that additional question, Adam. Thank you for joining us today. And thank you everybody for joining us too. If you came to the seminar a little bit late, 10 minutes late maybe, we will be putting the full recording up on the QA Financial website in a day or so. So we'll be sending everybody a link to access that recording on demand for posterity. And Adam, thank you once again.
Thank you, really appreciate it.
For the time and effort you've taken. And thanks again to Tricentis for partnering us with us on this seminar. And a reminder that you can visit the Tricentis virtual stand by clicking at the top left of the screen where it says back to your timeline. And you can find out a lot more information, downloads of videos and white papers about the Tricentis platforms, including Q-Test that Adam was describing in that booth. And otherwise, well, we hope to see everybody at our next event, which is actually on May 19th. We've got a deep dive conference where we're looking at the drivers of change in software quality management in different financial verticals, including exchanges, including, for example, wholesale banking, retail banking, robo-advisory businesses, and so on. Much more information on that on our website. Thank you all once again.